Boom. Okay. Hello, everyone. President Sunday here. I'm joined once again by Djalma Beorn, and we're going to be not just talking about the Rowling essay or something along those lines, which I haven't read yet. So you're largely going to be guiding me today. So, yeah, sorry we're late. The wind actually cut out my internet for a few minutes, so I actually couldn't.
Yeah, we live in that kind of place. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Do we want to post the essay up just so we sort of have it available for people to look at?
We absolutely can do that. I'm going to be going through it piece by piece because of kind of a methodological interest in doing that. One thing I did want to do, I think, before we start is give the viewers a little bit of context for why we're doing this right now.
Sure.
So basically, I have not waded into the J.K. Rowling turf wars. I shouldn't have said it that way. Oh gosh, it's already going badly for quite a while. But basically, J.K. Rowling is kind of like what one would call sort of a gender critical feminist, and a lot of what goes on in between what you would call trans exclusionary radical feminists and trans activists on the left and just in general, actually, tends to use rhetoric that the other group coins to refer to people. And so there's constant infighting among different groups about what is and isn't incendiary rhetoric. But in general, J.K. Rowling's been weaponizing a lot of stuff, including her own experiences, and making some, fault in my mind and to the mind of a lot of people, some false allegations about what it is that trans activists are doing, what they want, who trans people are, etc., to the end of promoting a view that fits in with her own deeply held beliefs. And so, as you can imagine, the whole thing is a minefield, all the more so because it's 2020 and everybody feels the need to interface every intellectual or pseudo-intellectual thing they do with their own life experiences in ways that I find incredibly stressful, but, fair enough. But then you end up in this kind of situation where most of what's put out there has at least some like rhetorical element or element of pathos to it. So it's really now more than ever, it's good to get into like what actual arguments are, because then we can see where someone's coming from and, maybe defeat some pretty problematic stuff. So that's kind of the context. She supported originally by a Forstater, or a tax specialist, who lost her job for what were deemed transphobic tweets. And then since then, she's kind of doubled down on her position about a womanhood being defined by biological sex and in opposition to manhood. And there's a whole bunch of gender critical, quote unquote, materialist feminist stuff that undergirds what she's saying, and she's caused a Twitter storm. So we want to go in and look at her most recent response from June 10th and kind of see like what she's saying about trans folks and how it's kind of mapping on to some of the responses. Because it's not just because it's topical, but also because there's a lot to be learned, I think, in how she responds here, both in terms of the rhetoric she takes on, some of the straw manning she engages in, and also some of the legitimate points that are kind of buried in the middle of all of it. So it'll be a good exercise in going through and seeing, actually reading what someone's writing, basically. So
I'm gonna post a link into the chat, so if anybody wants to read along with this, they can follow. This is an article that talks about the article, but it actually includes it in the middle. So just scroll down and you can see it there. And
warning, I have not read the article that talks about the article. I don't necessarily adhere to the views in the article that talks about the article. I've never seen it, so.
I haven't either. This is what is this on? Oh, it's Daily Mail. Okay, so nice neutral source. All right.
Excellent. Okay. So one thing I wanted to preface before getting into this is I know, Sunday, you've talked a lot about the importance of actually reading your source materials and kind of engaging directly, I just choked on myself, and interfacing with what you're putting out there. And so, something might be hateful or problematic or difficult, and certainly people don't have a duty to interact with those things. But if they're going to interact with them, they probably should read them. They probably should look at them in some detail to try and figure out what the person is at least trying to say. Yeah. Otherwise, what you get is kind of ideological approximation of views being bandied back and forth to the point that neither side really knows what the heck's going on anymore. And it's unfair to people wading into the debate. That being said, I think there's a very legitimate claim on the part of trans people that, who somebody is in terms of fundamental identification is not up for debate any less than you would say, ask someone whether they were really a Christian, right? It has that kind of level of offensiveness to it. So there is something that's on an existential level, that people are kind of responding to here. Okay.
Which if I may, and I mean, to be fair, like a lot of people on the anti-turf side, let's say, often
Yeah.
make the equivocation themselves. Saying that the identity itself is not up for debate is not the same thing as saying like the particularities of what constitutes that identity or whether or not that identity is appropriate, what have you, is not able to be positively discussed in a philosophically
Correct.
inquiring way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the analogy I think I draw is that, you know, if somebody was like deeply enmeshed in their faith for a really long time and it really was who they were to the world, and I kind of came in as some kind of random pseudo-educated, you know, secular pseudo-Christian and said, okay, this is what they believe in, this is who they are, this is my sense of them, that would be ludicrous, not just because I can't get inside their head phenomenologically, which is standpoint theory,
Sure.
but also because I haven't built up the knowledge base to actually meaningfully discuss something as intricate and complex as their own experiences with their Christianity, right? So that's another complicating factor, is that sure, we absolutely can talk about the particulars, and of course, like my work does talk about the particulars of identities, but it takes a lot of work, right? Like it's not a simple, straightforward claim that can be made. And just saying you've put in the work without actually putting forward arguments that can be interacted with is one of my pet peeves. So J.K. Rowling does actually put forward a lot of claims that she's done the work without actually doing the work, which is like, I've read things. It's like, congratulations, but like, what have you read? I'd rather you read one thing really, really well than read a bunch of stuff and claimed you've read it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so enough of that. Basically, so what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna literally read it, and I'm sorry if this is a bit dull. Hopefully it won't be, and if it gets dull at points, let me know and I'll just skip through that section.
Okay. I don't know if this is just, just before we go in, I don't know if this is just on my end, because again, my internet's really sketchy at the moment, but just try to go like a little bit slowly when you're actually reading the thing itself, just in case we miss bits.
Yeah, I talk way too quickly, especially.
No. You're talking fine. It's just I'm getting spots where it cuts out. So if you're talking at a faster speed, then I'm going to lose stuff if I blank out for a moment. We're in kind of a
not recite at the speed of sound. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So and then again, like warning, this has like really dank content. Bluntly, like it's got some really brutal stuff in it. Sunday loves. Yeah, I know. Sunday loves putting me on for things like eugenics and people's like, you know, weaponizing their own history of abuse and stuff. Like this is really like casual Sunday topic. Okay. So anyway, to get on with it. The first thing I'm going to do about framing this piece is keep in mind this piece is actually half preamble, and it only really gets into its central argument by the time she makes her fourth claim. One thing I think is important to do when reading people's responses to things is not to assume that the introduction actually has anything to do with what they're going to say. Often they don't get going until halfway through. And also it's very disingenuous for the first half, and it uses a lot of devices to kind of rhetorically get you on side before it makes the argument it makes about 2/3 of the way through. So keep that in mind. Okay, J.K. Rowling writes about her reasons for speaking out on sex and gender issues. She says, warning, this piece contains inappropriate language for children. Brace yourselves. This isn't an easy piece to write for reasons that will shortly become clear, but I know it's time to explain myself on an issue surrounded by toxicity. I write this without any desire to add to that toxicity. For people who don't know, last December, I tweeted my support for Maya Forstater, a tax specialist who lost her job for what were deemed transphobic tweets. So I'm going to read this first a little bit because it's kind of to be taken in one chunk. She took her case to an employment tribunal, asking the judge to rule whether a philosophical belief that sex is determined by biology is protected in law. Judge Taylor ruled that it wasn't. My interest in trans issues predated Maya's case by almost 2 years, during which I followed the debate around the concept of gender identity closely. I've met trans people. I've read sundry books, blogs, and articles by trans people, gender specialists, intersex people, psychologists, safeguarding experts. As somebody who's deeply enmeshed in the community of people she's describing and who's never heard of safeguarding experts, that should be like a little dog whistle right there. Social workers and doctors, and follow the discourse online and in traditional media. On one level, my interest in the issue has been professional because I'm writing a crime series set in the present day, and my fictional female detective is of an age to be interested in and affected by these issues herself, but on another, it's intensely personal, as I'm about to explain. All the time I've been researching and learning, accusations and threats from trans activists have been bubbling in my Twitter timeline. This was initially triggered by a like. When I started taking an interest in gender identity and transgender matters, I began screenshotting comments that interested me as a way of reminding myself what I might want to research later. On one occasion, I absentmindedly liked instead of screenshotting. single like was deemed evidence of wrongthink, and a persistent low level of harassment began. Months later, I compounded my accidental like crime by following Magdalene Burns on Twitter. Magdalene was an immensely brave young feminist and lesbian who was dying of an aggressive brain tumor. I followed her because I wanted to contact her directly, which I succeeded in doing. However, as Magdalene was a great believer in the importance of biological sex and didn't believe lesbians should be called bigots for not dating trans women with penises, dots were joined in the heads of Twitter trans activists. The level of social media abuse increased. I mention all this only to explain that I knew perfectly well what was going to happen when I supported Maya. I must have been on my 4th or 5th cancellation by then. I expected the threats of violence, to be told I was literally killing trans people with my hate, to be called a cunt and a bitch, and of course for my works to be burned. Although one particularly abusive man told me he composted them. What I didn't expect in the aftermath of my cancellation was the avalanche.
Just a quick interjection. Yes. So I just realized the link I posted is insufficient. It actually only goes about halfway through the article. Can you can you post the link to the chat that you're reading? Unless you have like a PDF or something, in which case we're kind of hooped.
Yeah, I kind of have a PDF, but can I post that in the StreamYard?
I'll tell you what. Send it to me, and I will post it.
Okay, I just sent it to you.
Okay. Great.
The one that I'm reading. Okay.
Oh, you're reading. Hang on. Oh, I see. Okay, jkrowling.com. Brilliant. Okay,
yeah,
great.
This was her literal response.
I couldn't find it anywhere, so that was okay. Cool.
It's really buried, but I like digging things out, so I found it.
So I'm posting the link to the article that we're reading in the description. The old link I posted is garbage. Don't look at it.
Yeah, and so there's, as per usual, a ton of meta commentary and a lot of circulation of the original piece, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to finish this one section then, just because I don't want this to drag on, and I want to kind of summarize this one section first, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so are we good?
I think we are good.
Okay. I mean, as good as we can be. Okay. Okay. Literally killing trans people with my hate, to be called kind of bitch, and of course my books to be burned. Although one particularly abusive man told me he composted them, which I found kind of hilarious. What I didn't expect in the aftermath of my cancellation, and you can probably imagine what rhetorically is going to follow this, was the avalanche of emails and letters that came showering down upon me, almost like owl mail. The overwhelming majority of which were positive, grateful, and supportive. And of course, they came from, you guessed it, trans people. They came from a cross-section of kind, empathetic, and intelligent people. Some of them working in fields dealing with gender dysphoria and trans people, who are all deeply concerned about the way a socio-political concept is influencing politics. Jesus Christ. Okay, sorry. Medical practice and safeguarding. They're worried about the dangers to young people, gay people, and about the erosion of women and girls' rights. Above all, they're worried about a climate of fear that serves nobody, least of all trans youth, well. I'd stepped back from Twitter for many months both before and after tweeting support for Maya Forstater because I knew I was doing nothing good for my mental health. I only returned because I wanted to share a free children's book during the pandemic. Immediately, activists who clearly believed themselves to be good and kind and progressive people swarmed back in my timeline, assuming a right to police my speech, accused me of hatred, calling me misogynistic slurs, and above all, as every woman involved in this debate will know, TERF. If you didn't already know, and why should you, TERF is an acronym coined by trans activists, which stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. In practice, a huge and diverse cross-section of women are currently being called TERFs, and the vast majority have never been radical feminists. Examples of so-called TERFs range from the mother of a gay child who was afraid her child wanted to transition to escape homophobic bullying, to a hitherto totally unfeminist older lady who's vowed never to visit Marks and Spencer again because which is a UK common clothing chain, because they're, or maybe in the US, I don't know, because they're allowing any man who says they identify as a woman into the women's changing rooms. Ironically, radical feminists aren't even trans exclusionary. They include trans men in their feminism. Oh man, because they were born women. Right. But accusations of TERFery have been sufficient to intimidate many people, institutions, and organizations I once admired who are cowering before the tactics of the playground. They'll call us transphobic. They'll say, I hate trans people. What's next? They'll say, you've got fleas? Speaking as a biological woman, a lot of people in positions of power really need to grow a pair, which is doubtless literally possible, according to the kind of people who argue that clownfish prove humans aren't a dimorphic species. And that's the intro.
Yeah.
Okay, so anybody who says J.K. Rowling isn't a good writer is, quite frankly, full of shit, because she's rhetorically actually quite brilliant and subtle. And this is very much evidence of that. So, you know, on a first glance read, this is actually like a fairly compelling argument for how somebody who's attempting to stand up for the dignity and the experiences and the position of a marginalized group of people is being assailed by these kind of petty, unthinking mob. And she kind of paints that picture extremely sympathetically and uses real details to do so. So that's the first initial gut reaction that I think a lot of people would have to this. What do you make of that? I'm just going to go into more detail after that.
Oh boy, I think you just read like 3,000 words.
Oh, the whole thing is 3,000 words. That was about 1,000.
Yeah. Off the top of my head, there's one thing that makes me just, I mean, if I tease it out a bit more, I'd probably have a few more things I want to press on this. But one of the things I really don't like is the sort of drawing on sort of anecdotally getting feedback from people or people you've encountered as if this was representative of
exactly.
Like attitudes that are endemic to any one of the groups that you're talking about in particular. So yeah, but I mean,
so
this is my first time reading this. So
this is like my second time reading it, but
just for my own edification, do you want to, I've heard this before, do you want to clarify the clownfish thing?
I don't really have too much information there to clarify with. I think what it's trying to say is that people are absolutely obsessed using the example of intersex people in proving that, you know, our assumption that human beings are purely male or female instead of a range of sexes chromosomally or gonadally in between male and female is wrong. And you can see this based on reference to other species. And so she's making quite a like vicious jab. They're saying that like, well, you know, if somebody wanted to sew balls on, I'm sure they could, which is like a pretty brutal medicalized jab at trans people. And also a bit ironic coming from her, given that she seems to think that the only legitimate trans people are trans people who are post-surgical or post-operative.
Right.
So it's like you're viciously mocking it at the same time indicating that that's the only thing that would make someone legitimate, which if you think about our previous stream and the entire pathological history associated with psychiatry and identity, it's that people in a naturalistic discourse really want to push people through those stages of transition.
Yeah.
So that kind of gets me into like the main point of analysis for this opening gambit, which is basically that like a terrible chess game where everyone's just drunk. Which is basically that she's absolutely inconsistent in how she's actually framing who trans people are. And so that's the first sign that maybe this is a bit of a specter, or maybe this is a bit of an amalgam that doesn't quite track what's actually going on. So basically, so what she's saying, okay, she supported someone who believed that sex is determined by biology, and that's protected in law. So that's kind of like her default position, which is that, how do I describe this? So biology invariably refers to genitalia. So she's not saying that like, because biology refers to basically anything that we could naturally associate with ourselves. So it could be chromosomes, like XY chromosomes.
Yeah.
It could be hormones. It could be phenotype. But in this case, it's probably genitals. And so she's articulating the classic view of gender is genital sex. And she wants to be able to support this without being hated on. And so she explains kind of what happens in relation to that. So she's like, here's the reasons why she can support this view. She has read a bunch of things that she doesn't really describe what they are. And then she also talks about how she's motivated to research trans issues, but only after framing it by saying biology is protected in law and supporting that view. So already you can see her kind of show her hand as someone who's pre-motivated to be predisposed to its attitude towards trans people that assumes there's something suspect or pathological, because to give you an example, the trans character is the villain in this narrative. And there's a lot of like hatefulness around, you're not even a real trans, you haven't transitioned, and all this kind of weird stuff like that. So she's kind of pre-motivated to want to pursue it from that angle, which usually, as we discuss, leads to bad inquiry. And then basically following that, she goes into kind of the unfairness of supporting a well-held position and then being attacked viciously for holding that position and harassed. And sure, that might be a problem. That'd be a problem with Twitter culture or activist culture in general right now. But she's slowly but carefully, rhetorically inserting details to predispose you to assume that the reasonable, well-held position is hers without really defending why. And that the violent, awful position is her interlocutors, even though really what she's tracking is their behavior, not their position.
That's good, because that's kind of what I was sort of formulating in my head before when you asked me my initial thoughts on that. And like she's using the Twitter reaction as a part of rhetorically bolstering the position for which she is being critiqued, which is obviously not a legitimate way to defend your argument.
Yeah. And so what I'm interested in is, at what point does she ever begin to defend her argument? But keep in mind the stuff. So the way she's bolstering it, how is she bolstering her position? Well, she's saying that she went in and tried to actually research trans issues. Of course, that was motivated with the desire to write a trans villain into a critical feminist narrative about a woman. So that's going to ideologically predispose her to look at it a certain way. She's also bolstering her position by saying that she was defending people who were kind of heroic on the surface of it, or who are heroic, like Magdalene Burns. Like, she was just defending this brave young feminist and lesbian who was dying of an aggressive brain tumor. It's like, wow, what a wonderful, lovely thing to do. But then when you read further, it's like Magdalene believed in the importance of biological sex. Biological sex is a reality. It's not really a thing that you can believe in normatively. Like, you can't believe in genitals, really. Like, it's a weird statement, and nobody really realizes how weird this is. But you can't really and my faith is in genitals is just such a creepy statement, but that's basically what she's saying here. And I'm being a bit reductive on purpose because I think that's really what it's amounted to at this point. And then so she's like a Magdalene, like this wonderful heroic lesbian who's, trying to preserve lesbian culture and preserve butch culture against these sort of trans men invaders and all this kind of, literally because they have penises, or they don't have penises and they want to use the weapon of a male to. There's a lot of hatred of phallic symbolism in butch culture, which, And so basically Magdalene was after being framed as this wonderful human being, Magdalene is then a great believer in biological sex, which, as I said, is a bit of a strange thing to say, and then believes that lesbians should not be called, and didn't believe lesbians should be called bigots for not dating trans women with penises.
Right.
So again, it's like, are trans people these things that exist in opposition to females? Are trans people, not real because they don't actually have a sex that's tracking a biological reality, aka genital reality, protected in law? And again, sex is also ideological as well as a fact. You could have constructions that are real. So that divide between constructionism and essentialism is kind of moot. But basically it's really unclear what trans people are at this point, and I would be extremely confused as to how to describe a trans person from what she said so far. They seem like halfway between a cackling enemy designed to destroy females, someone who's a complete liar, which is kind of similar to Talia May Betcher, who's a famous trans philosopher's article called Evil Deceivers and Make-Believers. So she has both those depictions. And then in addition to those two depictions, she also has this depiction where somehow trans women are women, but they're not women because penises, which I guess she's granting some extra ground here. So I'd be very confused what this trans woman figure was at this point. Violent foreign enemy type of woman that's not a real woman, someone who's just a man who's delusional, and she switches the rhetoric around what trans people even are many times. So far, I don't really know what's going on. Then basically she's talking about how people have continued to be unfair and mean to her, which is probably true. So what I don't like about this too is that as she proceeds through the paper, she tries to get people on board to be sympathetic to her and show her empathy, but she's straw manning trans people and framing trans people in a billion different ways simultaneously, and forcing people into an ideological view in a way that I think any critical person would be skeptical of, and then turns around and says, don't do the same to me. And, bluntly, my position is I don't want to do the same to her, because then I'd be no better. But I also think that she's not understanding the irony of what she's doing. So basically, she then switches away from ever coming up with a coherent vision of what trans people are, turns instead to some of the rhetoric that she's gotten, how she was told horrible things, as you said, by like individual actors. But those actors aren't representative. They're just actors saying things. I mean, sure, they have views that are potentially problematic or they don't, but they're individuals saying things. That's like, oh my God, I can't believe that these trans actors are saying she was killing people. And then, you know, the misogyny, which is problematic.
Yeah.
But then, of course, it's the other rhetorical move of like, but guess what? Trans people actually love me. Because, of course, people are individuals. Some are going to love her. Some are going to hate her. Some are going to be sympathetic to things. And occupying a certain positionality doesn't mean you don't either hate yourself or like have a traditional political view about what your subject position ought to be. There's a lot of weird trans people in terms of like their own self-loathing. And there's also trans people who I think
well,
have traditional views of gender, right?
Well, I mean, it's weaponizing a very small cross-section of a very particular and very complex philosophical set of debates.
Yeah.
In order to strong-arm a position on one without actually doing any of the work to defend any position philosophically. So
I'd say so. And then the other thing that's even weirder is that it's not just a philosophical position, like it's an existing identity. Like trans people do exist, and this is just sort of like a brute force reality.
Right. So just for clarification for the chat. So again, like the general objection that I think we're sharing here, and obviously Djalma has a much more nuanced perspective on this than I do. But the general perspective, it's not even necessarily. I mean, no doubt there are extensive disagreements with the actual argument itself, but primarily the issue is that it's not even functionally an argument. It's a by way of cheating you into being sympathetic to her without actually reasoning to that position.
Exactly. And also, and then on top of that, if what you're going after is the legitimacy of someone's claim to a real identity, like being a woman, being trans, being Christian, you know, being a certain type of person, you need to have an argument that argues against why that person should be able to be themselves. I mean, on a certain view, like on a moral view, you shouldn't be producing those kinds of arguments. But if you were going to like have the guts to do that, then you ought to at least produce an argument. So then, but I also find on an incidental aesthetic level, the framing of trans people to be kind of interesting. The evil deceiver make-believe view, the partially acceptable but not completely because genitals, we need to believe in genitals because genitals are the basis of oppression. All this kind of like stuff that gets looped into it. So if we backtrack for just a moment, I think this is going to be interesting context for people. So the title of this video is like hilariously like this like long-winded, horrible, like continental Harry Potter book, basically. So the Putatively Ameliorative Project, like someone just shoot me. Don't, please, actually. And basically what this means is that when you look at a gender critical position, this is often kind of the loop-de-loop that's at the heart of it. Women have experienced oppression. Nobody is denying this. Nobody's denying this continues to occur. And also it's not a zero-sum game. It's not like you get a bunch of like oppression cookies and then if one type of woman is oppressed, then another type of woman isn't oppressed. And one type of woman's being oppressed means another type of woman, you know, won't get those specific resources. It's like, no. And the reason, and in fairness, that's a bit of an underselling of Rowling's position. The reason why Rowling is even saying that is because she's saying that it's the trans position to assume that gender isn't real. Not true at all. It's just the trans position to assume that gender isn't merely attributable to the genitals. The classic argument that's given is if a woman has a full, or a person with a vagina, if you want to say it that way, although she gets into that too, has a full hysterectomy. So they have their uterus removed and they have everything else removed. We suddenly call them like an unwoman. That seems like a Atwoodian nightmare, frankly. So we wouldn't call them we wouldn't say they weren't a woman. There are many people who walk around who do not have the genitals that correspond to their apparent gender, who we immediately would say, yep, that's a woman, that's a man, that's this type of person. So in practice, we never actually check people's genitals. And it's kind of a really good thing we don't do this because it would be a pretty violent and invasive culture if we did.
Well, somebody in the chat actually mentioned Terry Pratchett, who wrote on this. He wrote a book called Monstrous Regiment. And like it points out this distinction between sex and gender very well, because what happens is, as is revealed through the Discworld is at war, basically, and it follows this one woman named Polly who dresses up as a man in order to go fight. And over the course of the story, it is revealed that all of these like varying degrees of excellent or not so excellent soldiers, like it's almost a parody of Platoon or something, have done exactly the same thing, right up to the gruff major who's leading them into war, and it emphasizes that distinction. Like when we're talking about gender, you're talking about, I mean, now certain people may include genitalia into a description of a social role, but the social role is in fact distinct, because these characters, now there are people who will argue that these characters wouldn't in reality fulfill that social role. I tend to be skeptical of that position. But insofar as you can imagine them doing it, you can see very much the distinction. If a person acts in that capacity, that is
totally
what they are in gender terms.
And somebody could start screaming around that that's functionalism, but actually, that comment is really like, oh, it's so good, because it brings up 2 points that kind of will fit into the rest of this. We don't have to read this whole thing through in excruciating detail, right?
Thank you.
But basically, I just wanted to give a little flavor of it, and then I'm going to skip ahead to point 4, where she actually gets into the argument. But I love things that go wrong and people who do a bunch of weird shit wrapped up with some occasional legitimacy, because I find it like sociologically interesting, but I'm about the only person who does. So that's fine. But basically, to further your point about Terry Pratchett and kind of the notion of like how we end up arriving at these gender roles, this gets into the title of the video a little bit, because all right, I'm going to go through 3 steps. So we're going to go back to, I need to get my thinking organized here a little bit. I'm like going to start sniffing wildly, except not nearly as well as Zizek would. I don't do anything as well as Zizek ever would, but I'm getting into that mode suddenly of like, ah. So to get back to the original point about TERFs, and whether you can call them TERFs is a whole other debate. The idea is that people are oppressed because they are marked as belonging to a class of individuals who have certain types of genitals. As a result of being marked as part of this oppressed class as possessors of, bluntly, vaginas, or something similar to that, they are marked for unfair treatment, or lower position in a relational hierarchy, or to be under-resourced in some kind of hierarchical imagining. And this is the classic kind of feminist position around that. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that eventually we would want to do away with gender. This is the irony of the position. So what they're saying is that only the people who are marked as having inferior status by dint of their possession of a certain type of genitals count as this type of person. On the flip side, we don't care about these categorizations. We want to be rid of them. Yet we will die on the altar of ensuring that trans women are never counted as among those people, because they don't have the right genitals to be counted as among those people. But oppression, as we talked about, and privilege and all these things don't narrowly track gender identification. And also, trans people don't wake up one day and are like, oh, I'm going to eschew my privilege, or, oh, I'm going to become this big man and take on all this privilege.
Do we Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. No, they go through their whole lives, right?
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say, like, somebody in the comments section wrote something that might be worth addressing. So Northern Observer writes, women oppressed in this gynotopia, tell it to Yin Gameshi, persecuted by the state for a personal conduct dispute that should never have left the HR department. Did you want to weigh in on that comment?
I'm going to weigh on in a minute. I just wanted to kind of finish off this one stream. So that's the first thing with the TERF position. Yeah. Then again, the Terry Pratchett thing, it's like, okay, so we have this ameliorative view of gender. What ameliorative means is that we utilize the gender concept for the sake of achieving a political goal, or we utilize X concept for the sake of achieving a political goal. And it is important to us insofar as it achieves that goal. And this is kind of the tradition that Rowling is in. There's a lot of trans people who are in the same tradition in relation to trans as a purely political category. Yeah. And what I think ameliorative projects are important. I think obviously being a good, shitty Foucauldian or whatever I am, that this is going to be an important part of projects, period. But by the same on the same register, it's really depressing to have to occupy an identity knowing that ideally the world would do without you, and that your identity is solely defined by the fact that you're oppressed is a really terrible hell to live in, and also not indicative of the kind of things that actually mark people as having different identities. And so this is one thing that maybe trans culture can help the feminist cause with, not that trans women aren't women, because descriptively they are. And that's that when we're dealing with how someone enters into an identity, imagine a purely ameliorative world. That would require men who want to be women, or who are women and want to come out as women, to say, I feel really like I ought to be oppressed. And I feel like I identify with being oppressed. nobody does that. They're like, I feel like I'm a woman because I want to embrace femininity as this positive descriptive set of traits, or because I see the benefit in leading a life that I would think of as virtuously feminine. And this is really the motivation that goes into a lot of people's thinking. But in common discourse, because we have this idea that X is oppressed because X possesses Y traits, suddenly we're obsessed with the possession of genital traits, the possession of physically embodied traits, the possession of like things you can measure and blood you can take and things you can do to people. And so suddenly being a woman or a man becomes all about transitioning, becomes all about oppression and non-oppression. And it's fucking depressing because there's way more that goes into it than that. We know this because you can have like the fruitiest people ever who are still masculine, or you could have the most and fruity in like a positive, like queer positive sense. And you can have feminine people who are, no, totally though, because I'm saying it self-referentially, but that's why it's awesome.
This is what gets my channel banned. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, exactly. Or you could have these feminine people who are just like ball breaking bluntly, but in their femininity. And it's kind of fascinating to see. And I think it's really revolutionary. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that this whole thing is depressing to some extent and misses the point, because as long as we're not talking about the positive traits people embody as either gender or even as not either gender, as a new set of genders, if people want to go that route for the really radical, that's a much more interesting discussion. So getting back to the Terry Pratchett thing, yes, people can embody identities based on how they want to define their gender roles and who they want to be in the world in a way that kind of makes them responsive and socially responsible. So John Radcliffe Hall was a trans man who wrote The Well of Loneliness in the 1940s, I believe, and was super influenced by Havelock Ellis and a lot of the naturalists of the time who were trying to carve out the category of trans, or the category of invert or trans. The category of invert is something that wasn't necessarily negative. And he was writing to his lover, and he called himself he in his private correspondence to his lover, but everyone else knew him as a woman. And basically he was like, there was this colonel in the war, Colonel Barker, who had gone and disguised, was a woman who had gone disguised herself as a man to get away from her abusive husband. And she was quite stocky and like physically fit. And so she was able to fight in the war and disguise herself as a man for a number of decades. And in the process of her doing this, she came out as trans because she's like, I'm an invert because I've realized in the process of being a man for so long, fulfilling the social functions of being a man and preferring to be a man, I've kind of become a man. Like I've kind of earned this for myself in a weird, like not the idea you can earn it, but he had this sense of having earned it. And he switched his pronouns to he, even back in the 1940s. And so there was a sense in which it was like, yeah, it's a thing you do. It's a way you take responsibility or behave or act in the world. And this can happen like post hoc. This can happen by accidentally stepping into a role even and then having it solidified. So it's hardly this like revelation that you have where you decide that you need to deal with gender dysphoria, although that's really a real phenomena. Yeah. It's so much more than that.
Well, that's interesting too, because now you're actually distinguishing between like different trans identities and dysphoria itself. Like dysphoria by itself doesn't actually signify that.
No, it doesn't. And one of the things that is really problematic about a lot of the rhetoric on the quotes TERF gender ameliorative side, or just gender ameliorative side period without being TERFy, is and also among certain trans activists is the idea that you have to be going through this medical process of transition that strictly involves rearranging your body in a specific way to deal with some dysphoria in order to be trans. When, as far as I'm concerned, people who occupy gender identities that don't require that don't think of their genitals constantly when they're acting. You know what I mean? Like,
actually, just relative to the thing you just were talking about. Fascinatingly, in emphasizing the actual medical transition itself, what's de-emphasized is all of the psychological aspects that would or would not make the medical transition itself appropriate.
Exactly. And the medical transition for a lot of people would occur because you just can't live as yourself in the world because people won't acknowledge it unless it looks like it, bluntly, which is really awful. But it also shows that you can't just have this little like objectivist, egoist, Randian experience of self-actualization without reference to the world. Like people have to be acknowledged on a basic level for who they are. And eventually it gets incredibly grating and painful and awful to be persistently not acknowledged, despite having to take on, in some cases, the full burden and responsibility of the role. It's like you're doing all the things that make you that thing, but at the same time, nobody's ever going to acknowledge it because, you know, you look like a woman, bluntly, or you look like something, or if you're a woman who's done all these things that to really triumph as a certain type of person. Or even people who are non-binary, like you look wrong or something, and then the emphasis has become on looking right.
Maybe this is a good transition into the gynotopia comment.
Exactly. So the gynotopia comment. Okay, so first of all, I don't believe that there is a gynotopia. So I just disagree with you on the face of it. I think that society is still very eminently and obviously patriarchal. So that's my position on that. But about it becoming a gynotopia, I think that represents in some ways a very real concern about the loss of masculine virtue in society in a specific sense, and has very little to do with feminization, rather this kind of concern about where masculinity is in 2020. So I understand the feeling there. I just, yeah.
If I can also just add in addition to that, I think also, like he mentions Ian Ghomeshi in particular, I think there's also two things going on there. So it's not just a decline in masculine virtue, as you just called it. It's also, strangely enough, it's a perverse, almost infantilizing of women in a lot of respects, by simply assuming an inability, for example. Now, I don't know much about the Ian Ghomeshi case, except that I have reasons to suspect there might be an element of truth in some of the reports. Nonetheless,
I mean, I believe what they're saying about Ghomeshi, so I'm just going to point blank.
I just haven't looked into it, so I don't know.
Okay, well, I haven't. I believe it.
Okay, well, fair enough. But like the idea, like I think what this is pointing to is a general tendency of, in particular, like HR departments, human rights things, like, you know, the usual slate of suspects. To not be able, for whatever reason, to suspect guile on the part of biological females.
And I also think that it has to do with this sort of really creepy essentialist sort of Christian notion of like femininity mapping naturally onto womanliness, and women having this sort of the bureaucratization and the passivity that the world has fallen into is the result of like the ascension of women, which is not true, because you're taking individual actors and assuming like generic traits across an entire class of people. And also because, you know, women can be anything. Like, you know, this is going to be the worst, that people are going to hate this. Women can be anything. Women could be men, right? So, and there's a lot of women who become men upon being given the chance to do that. And that kind of gets back into Rowling's statement. And as to whether the world has become feminine, you know, you can make an argument either way. I'm not particularly interested in that argument. I think there's some ways in which masculine virtue desperately needs updating and reincorporation into society. But whether or not the world's become feminine isn't really about the ascension of women or not. It's about whether the world is embracing a set of virtues and values that we've dubbed feminine that we think of as problematic or not. So I don't know. Like, that's all I can really say about that one point. I kind of want to get into like some of the meat of where the argument comes out in this piece, though.
Okay, let's go for it.
Switch. Okay, let's go for it. Okay, so basically, there's this idea that being trans is this kind of socio-political concept influencing politics, medical practice, and safeguarding. I don't really know how we can imagine a social concept like gender or ethnicity or class or anything that doesn't influence society. It's just almost tautological to say that something social influences society. And of course it influences medical practice, because exactly what we talked about with the centrality of transitioning in legitimizing trans identity. And, you know, gender dysphoria is real and it is linked to trans identity. I'm not trying to say that it's not. And transitioning is important for some people. Okay, so then I want to get into like the reasons. So she's worried about the new trans activism for 5 reasons. First, she has a charitable trust that focuses on alleviating social deprivation in Scotland, with a particular emphasis on women and children. Among other things, my trust supports projects for female prisoners, and for survivors of domestic and sexual abuse. I also fund medical research into MS, a disease that behaves very differently in men and women. It's been clear to me for a while that the new trans activism is having, or is likely to have, if all its demands are met, a significant impact on many of the causes I support, because it's pushing to erode the legal definition of sex and replace it with gender. Okay.
It's the reverse though, isn't it? It's replacing. I mean, it's not really replacing the legal definition of sex, but it's actually almost replacing the concept of gender by masking it with legal language that references it while using it strictly in terms of sex.
I mean, yeah, I kind of see that. One of the things, this is one of those times when, like, you know, I think people screaming like, give me data when someone's making a qualitative or philosophical argument is just the most infuriating. Yeah. But this is like an actual empirical argument without data. So I kind of want to see this because I take her claim seriously here, but I think there may also be a category error going on, which would be that, look, when you have a 55-year-old black man and a 20-year-old white man, they're going to have the person of color is going to be, and I say black instead of person of color for specific reasons that I think anti-black sentiment arises from erasing black identity into the category person of color. Like, there's a complex reason for that. But basically, that person is going to have a different variety of medical structural concerns than somebody who is white, like more predisposed to diabetes, more predisposed to certain types of physical conditions. And the medical world has kind of eschewed that until recently, and is basically focused on the young white man as the sort of prototype for medical practice. But there's very different things between a 2-year-old male child, you know, and individuals of different ethnicities, ethnic backgrounds, individuals who have other complicating conditions, and yet they're all males with medical needs. And so it doesn't strike me as odd that, for instance, trans men would have completely different medical needs as men than other men. So when she gets into this whole thing about how, you know, MS behaves differently in men and women, it's like, yes, but you don't need to frame it in those terms in order to appropriately treat it. So you can say that females will respond a specific way to MS compared to males. But you can also say that trans men will respond a specific way to MS compared to other men. You can account for that really easily and even fight for more people and the inclusivity actually bolsters and reifies the definition of how to treat the medical conditions. And in addition to that, there's a lot of trans activism may be doing this in some senses, but when we're getting rid of like the legal definition of sex on narrow grounds, we're not changing the medical categories and we're not changing the metaphysical descriptions. We're changing a legal definition so that certain people aren't like, you know, fully assailed. So
no, right, exactly. So this doesn't actually impede. Now, I mean, here's one area where I can see somebody maybe challenging this, and that's that.
Sure.
Legal measures to assist, for example, medical services that are engaging with these categories, may themselves be misdirected, may themselves what they target may be, the range of what they target may be changed based on these legal definitions. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. And so then that's something where you have to be very aware of what is going on and make it clear and make your terms clear and make it clear what kind of projects are worth supporting and why. So that requires, guess what? Like more arguments, basically, right? Yeah. Okay, so the second reason why she's upset with trans activism is she's an ex-teacher and a founder of a children's charity. So immediately she's now associating trans women in particular with pedophiles.
I mean, not necessarily. Hang on. No. Maybe that's unfair. So she says the reason I'm an ex-teacher, she's just giving a reason for why she's interested. Well, okay, education and safeguarding.
Yeah, and so no, that's because.
Can you explain this term to me here, safeguarding? Like, what is this referring to?
I actually don't know, and I think what it is it's that, look, children aren't. It's the classic argument legitimate that children aren't sufficiently able. So I'm joking about the.
Well, no, but you know what? Actually, she just follows that by saying, "I have deep concerns about the effect the trans rights movement is having on both." Now, I think associating that with pedophilia maybe.
Yeah, that's stupid.
That's certainly in the popular discussion, of course, but I think generally, like what immediately comes to my mind is debates around people transitioning before puberty.
That's right. That's what. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so basically what she's saying is that she wants to educate. So what she's interested in, she gets into more later on, is that when girls are being treated in ways that are misogynistic and make it hard for them to live as girls in the world, or are being treated in ways that are homophobic if they like other girls, then an easy escape can be to transition away and become a male. And she doesn't want people to have to take that on because they're suffering so horribly under misogynistic paradigms. Oh my gosh. And so there's so much that goes into that. It's that mainly, so we ought to deal with the prevalent misogyny, especially that's that targets butch and gender nonconforming females who identify as women. And that's a serious issue. But there's so much that goes into the butch trans borderlands discussion. I mean, part of the reason why butch girls are targeted for discrimination is because they often behave in ways that are considered more stereotypically masculine, which is a fine distinctive line between that and being a trans man, despite there being a whole bunch of ideological baggage that would separate the two. So I don't think that it's like, oh, here's this easy out, like just get the surgery as a kid and you'll be fine. I don't think anyone thinks that. And I think that that's really strawmanning something that's a serious issue in terms of how narrow and misogynistic we are towards girls and women, right?
Let me alter that a tiny bit. I don't think many people who are taken very seriously. I don't think many serious people think that. There are definitely people who think that. There's definitely a lot of really reckless attitudes in sort of the activist communities, for example, towards these things.
But there is very much a felt sense that she describes later on in the article about being a type of girl or woman who ends up having to feel, quotes, androgynous or sexless, as she frames it, because you simply can't stomach what's available socially to you. And that's a big problem. And that's a big problem in general. And that's not going to go away or be worsened necessarily by transitioning, because you don't have to become the same type of man other people are, and the categories can be adjusted. And also, that's not really a motivating reason to switch one's gender. Like, people have an iota of dignity, right? Like, they want to fight for who they are and they want to fight for the group they belong to. And they're going to fight for the fullest, best realization of who they are within the context of that group. So, and that's just sort of a human nature thing, right?
This is where I start to feel a bit sympathetic towards gender abolitionists, for example, because if you think about this, what this means is that the choices being presented to a lot of really young people is either be in this sort of null area where you're occupying this weird space that doesn't actually reflect your proclivities, your personality, your character, your relation to your society, or get a surgery.
Yeah. So the answer to that isn't get rid of gender. The answer to that is to start having serious metaphysical discussions about what gender is. And also to talk about the richest, fullest conception we can have of different types of categories, so people can be who they are with a degree of pride. That's where the notion of pride comes from to begin with. So I think that's a serious issue, but I also think that people are going to transition regardless of that. And I think that there's absolutely room for both. Again, we're not dealing with real politics, like zero-sum game here, right?
Yeah.
But
to be clear, by the way, I'm not a gender abolitionist. I'm just saying I kind of get where they're coming from.
I kind of do too. Just because when the options are that horrific, like, you kind of want to dispense with all of it. And bluntly, like, many years ago, at this point, I can actually say that about 15 years ago, I ran around saying that, like, I don't have a gender, because I got fed up with it. And I was sort of, I didn't realize what I was doing, but I just couldn't cope with what I thought were the available options. And I did find a lot of things like suffocating and limiting about my social position, to the point that it does, the epistemic injustice thing isn't just BS. Like, there's a real, how do I describe this? There's a real impact that being constantly framed as insufficient, especially intellectually or practically, has on a person, such that they actually are able to think less clearly. It's hard to explain. It happens to people in a classist way too, when they're not able to access resources, or they're framed as being lesser because they're not as formally educated. Like, it becomes a type of injustice, right?
Here's a great example of how this might occur. So Aristotle, for example, he ascribes the range of, like, the eudaimon, the good-spirited person, the person who exhibits the range of human virtues, is always male in Aristotle's writing, because females simply can't attain to those. Now, here's the thing. Aristotle had a tendency to naturalize, to sort of take for granted the conditions of like certain conditions of Athenian life as ideal. Now he was
Yeah.
selective, of course. The ones that seemed intuitively to be good to him, he took as ideal. Other ones he was perfectly willing to criticize. But when you actually look at the actual way in which households, sort of husband-wife unions, for example, came about in Athens, you had a situation in which men and women were being educated differently. Women were marrying much younger than men. And so it's like, no wonder Aristotle observes the wives are not as intelligent as the husbands, and they're not as brave, what have you. Of course not. They're children, first of all, and secondly, they weren't trained to be those things.
And I've always wanted to be able to comment on that and say, yeah, you're right, they're not. And that's because there's been an endless social looping effect that's forced them into a situation where it would be exceedingly difficult, even as young people, after their, lifestyle and behavior and minds have solidified into a certain pattern set of behaviors, it would be exceedingly difficult to resist that. I resisted many aspects of my own socialization at a relatively young age. And yeah, I was somewhat resourced to do that, but not substantially. I also was in a series of abusive relationships when I was younger, and with people who basically denigrated my abilities and prevented me from gaining the access to resources that I needed. So I had to kind of do it anyway and get rid of them eventually. And I did that sufficiently young enough that it didn't like mar me for life. But there's a point at which resisting one's socialization actually becomes exceedingly difficult, because you don't have to be weak-minded. In fact, it's often a sign of intelligence that you loop into and take on the things you're repeatedly told you exhibit over time. Like, you really become that thing. It becomes more and more difficult to actually break out of that category of being. And also in most cases, when you're in an oppressed sort of situation in a domestic sphere, you would fear for your life. I mean, there's the brute force reality that one could kill the other. Like, a male could kill a female, but a female couldn't kill a male, still pervades a lot of female thinking in certain situations, and it's brutal.
Well,
it's
incidentally, bring that back to the Yin Gomeshi thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Exactly. My goal, so that therefore the female's goal becomes to be as maximally appealing and supportive and interesting as possible. And so the male continues to show interest in her so she survives and so she can have children in a stable environment or have any kind of quality of life. It becomes like a task in getting his approval and his support such that she can establish herself in her own abilities. It's brutal. And people think, oh, that's not the case anymore. It's absolutely the case. It is like, yes, that's an anecdotal statement, but on a non-intellectual register, it's not that women are less capable of thinking for themselves. It's that when you're socialized into something over a lifetime and you're persistently vulnerable, you internalize what the people making you vulnerable say about you out of the need for bare bones survival. And it's strong as well as weak people that do that.
Well, that's what's kind of interesting, though, is like when we're talking, when people are talking about a gynotopia, I think that was the word. What they're describing.
I think it's a disgusting word, actually.
Fine, but what's being described, and I agree, what's being described is a situation in which law has basically become uncharacteristically historically receptive to basically success in doing exactly what you just described. Because the legal assumption here, again, with the Yin Gomeshi, and why, I mean, here's the thing. In terms of how it was presented to the public, it did seem as if it was under-argued, the actual reasons for his initial firing, what have you. And things like this do indeed happen.
Sure.
Yeah, but where was I going with this? Shoot. Oh, damn it. Did I just...
And it's happening to me all the time. I mean, I think the point is that what I'm saying is I'll let you kind of think about that. But this is non-exhaustive. This is the only archetypal relationship, the oppression of women.
Right. Okay. Sorry.
Got
it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's becoming it's law becoming perhaps excessively receptive to a mode of behavior that is specifically developed to counteract an extreme disparity in power. Right?
Yeah. I can see that. At the same time, I don't kind of like where my functionalist thinking is going on this. Like, I think that I'm still kind of like a secret existentialist. I think that at any point, people are capable of resisting or breaking free of even a lifetime of socialization. I think change is possible. And I think that, women are immensely powerful via having that double gaze and that ability to look at things through those lenses, trans women and other women. When I say women, I just say women simplistic because I'm including trans women in that category, which I have well-held reasons to do, because I don't believe in genitals. Like, I believe they exist. I don't believe in them like I believe in Santa Claus, right? So basically, it's one of these things where I think that resistance is still possible and important and necessary and happens at all stages of life, and that people have sort of some degree of responsibility to rebel against that. I'm just really understand how easy it is to become the thing you're repeatedly told you are. Anyway, so that whole tangent kind of aside, she's then getting into, all that tangent, which is like the key of everything aside. She's now getting into like her third and fourth reasons. The fourth reason, which is where it gets truly personal. It's hilarious she frames it that way, because that's like the first real argument. The third is that as a much banned author, so incendiary, I'm interested in freedom of speech and have publicly defended it, even unto Donald Trump. Okay. I mean, you're speaking here, aren't you? I'm freely responding to you. So I feel like that's a giant red herring that's been dropped into the middle of this. That
I don't follow Rowling at all, because she writes books about wizards and I don't care about her politics. But
yeah, I don't either.
A much banned author. Do you have any idea what she's talking about?
Well, she's talking about Harry Potter books being banned, especially in the 1990s, for being unchristian, right? In certain Bible Belt areas.
I forgot that was a thing.
Yeah, and they were like, what
an innocent time that was.
It really was. And people were like, you can't read Harry Potter, and like ripping out pages of Harry Potter. And
funny story. So I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian household, becoming progressively less fundamentalist as we grew up. But we were... Like, I remember one day coming home from school, watching Pokemon, and my parents being really, really upset that at one point Jesse and James were wearing invisibility suits and talking behind someone's, like they had somebody basically at gunpoint behind them in invisibility suits, and they were speaking as if they were them to sneak into a building. And for whatever reason, my parents were convinced that this was demonic possession. And so we had like an hour-long conversation. I know.
Oh, no.
Okay, so funny story actually relating to Harry Potter. So one birthday I got Harry Potter 4, like the hardcover of the Goblet of Fire, and I was reading it.
That one's a really good one.
I think it's the best one, honestly.
It's so good.
I think that one, I'm torn between that one and Order of the Phoenix. But
I don't know. I'm a Goblet of Fire fan.
Harry Potter 4 was scary.
It was epic. Like, the ending was just like the Voldemort cauldron thing was like, it was just so spot. Anyway, let's stop geeking about that.
Anyways, but just I remember one time I was reading it, and I got to the part where they have to go into the lake and collect like the hostages, and they encounter what are they called, Grindylows, and it describes them as water demons. Shoot, demons! I actually tore the pages that said demons out so I wouldn't have to lose my Harry Potter book. For some reason, I was so convinced that my parents would find the word demon in the book and take away my Harry Potter. So
here's the thing about your parents, though, that's apparent from that, which, not to suddenly defend them or anything, but it gets into the difference between them and other people who are more other fundamentalists. They're critical thinkers. They're at least they're creative. Like, they're thinking about actually having well-held values and beliefs, where if they hold a certain position, they want to suss the world out, preemptively and kind of terrifyingly, potentially, for evidence of things that would contradict that position, or that would be problematic under that position, and then explain it to you, which is like, wow. So even as they were doing something like that, they were also probably teaching you like critical thinking skills in the process, because they're saying, here's my argument for why this thing in the world is wrong according to our position. You can be like, pardon my language, you're fuck crazy, but at the same time, this is a well-held belief that you have, and you're going to show me exactly what is problematic about this. So that's like, these are smart people, right?
Oh, tremendously smart. Just in a very weird social situation. But
it's like my little point is that, like, in some ways, those people are smarter than Rowling here, who is not willing or able to do that, which is like, come on, right? So anyway, that aside, I have my own Rowling story, by the way, that I wanted to like add into this. When I was 8 years old, we got tickets from my mom's work to go see in like this giant arena J.K. Rowling talk.
Yeah.
And she was asking the audience, like kids, like who their favorite character was, and being able to tell her that was like the coolest thing ever. And so I was like this little like edgelord, so I was like, Tom Riddle's my favorite character because he's really like complex, and so I was like, thought it was so cool, and so my favorite character was Voldemort at the time, and one kid is like, my favorite character is Voldemort, and she's like, that is totally inappropriate to the kid in this arena. she's like, it is never acceptable to enjoy evil, and then I was like, oh my god, like even as an 8-year-old, I was like, but the kid wasn't enjoying evil. They were enjoying the complexity and nuance and how that character was written. So you see kind of like that dogged sort of knee-jerk reactionary thinking, even when she was like, that is unacceptable. You're not allowed to enjoy Voldemort as a character. It's like a really well-written villain. Like, you're not allowed to enjoy that.
Did he actually say Voldemort, or did he say Voldemort?
He said Voldemort.
Yeah, of course.
Not Voldemort, not Flight of Death.
It's French. I love how like they're so... They had so little confidence in their audience they couldn't even pronounce the name properly, despite having Rowling as like a as an advisor. Come on.
But I have to admit, this 8-year-old didn't come in like, you know, smoking a cigar, being like, Voldemort, he's interesting to me. Like, he didn't like go in and do that. So, but nonetheless, that was totally like, I thought that was so messed up, and I'm like, I hate her for like 2 weeks after that, because she was ruining my ability to enjoy the characters and the experience of the book for like a couple of weeks. Little did I know. Anyway, that's my...
Rowling who said that?
Yeah, it was Rowling who said this to her.
Really? I for some reason my brain told it like his mother or something. That's...
No,
wow.
It was Rowling who announced that. She's like, it is never acceptable to enjoy a character who's depicted as evil. That is wrong. And the kid was like devastated because Rowling herself had said this to the kid. And so for 2 weeks after, I was like, J.K. Rowling's stupid. And I just like kept reading it anyway, but was like internally really angry because she was wrecking my like edgelord experience of liking Tom Riddle.
That's just kind of awful. I don't get what is with people who are cruel to children. I think one that comes to mind too is I forget who it was, that Republican guy, but his kids wanted Seth Rogen's autograph, and he just wouldn't give it to him.
Well, I know it's I don't know. I think people get ahead of steam when they're celebrities, and they think that like they don't live for anybody else, but that's how they became celebrities.
I don't even think it's a head of steam thing. I think there has to be something wrong with you to be cruel to children generally. I don't like even... I think so too. Like I don't care about how dire the politics is. As soon as kids are involved, it's a different thing. But that's just me.
And you know, maybe we're being overly ungenerous in saying she's cruel, but I just find that I found it interesting too, because she was even willing to tell this kid like this morally didactic framing about Voldemort, basically, right? And then here's the irony of that, because somebody attacked her by saying, I was transphobic. This is later on in the article. Like, I was a cunt. I was a bitch, a turf. I deserved canceling, punching, and death. You are Voldemort, said one person, clearly feeling this was the only language I'd understand. And I was like, oh, speaking of that.
You're cutting out a little bit.
And you'd hate that, wouldn't you? Am I back or?
I think so.
Okay, that could just be location. So. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah. No. You weren't inaudible. It's just it was cutting out briefly. Can you hear me?
Okay, that's fine. So then basically, I can hear you perfectly.
Good. Okay.
Okay.
I think there's lag.
So the fourth thing, which is where things start.
Yeah, there's definitely lag.
Should we take a 5-minute break, reset it, and keep going?
Yeah, sure. So what I'll do is I'll remove you from the stream, then I'll add you back, and we'll see if that
perfect
helps.
Sounds good. And then you can entertain them with rolling stories in the meantime.
Yeah, if anybody has questions, now's probably the time. I don't know how much longer we wanted to go for this. We could have a sequel if we wanted to go through the whole thing, because there's still quite a bit. What do you think? Yeah,
I mean, I'm okay to like give it, another 40 minutes or so, and then kind of wrap it up. Because I think I can get through the rest of what I want to without having to doggedly go through all of it. I just started doing that because it was a good way of breaking into it, right?
Yeah. Oh,
okay. So I'm going to get some water.
Better now. It's caught up a little bit, but yeah, if we want to take a 5-minute water break, anybody has questions, now's the time to ask, and we'll get back to it.
Okay. So I'll see you in 5 minutes.
Sounds good. How are we doing, chat? It's been a bit of a technical mess this morning. We have a wicked windstorm in Victoria. I actually, my power is flickering this morning, which is why we started a bit late. Actually, it was a bit of a fight to get the internet running. But, yeah. I'm just going to go through the chat if anybody had comments. Katsuma Kyoto, you were addressing a rather interesting conversation. You said there are no coherent cross-cultural gender roles. I would actually like to address that myself really quickly, just while I'm here by myself. To a certain extent, there are, but I think also with culture, we have to recognize that many of our cultures are not just cross-pollinating with each other, but they have common roots. So, yeah, I mean, Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges' book, The Ancient City, is really interesting because he actually traces the household structure of Greece, for instance. To I think he does a lot of his work. A lot of his work is an exegesis on the Vedic texts. So he draws a common root between really a whole bunch of stuff stemming from into India as well as into Europe. So it's, yeah, all right. Yeah, and Horizonberg writes, when you throw open the doors of bathrooms and change rooms to any man who believes or feels he's a woman and ... I think Djalma will actually have something to say on that as well. Are you there?
Back.
You're back?
So what's our plan? I'm back. What's our plan?
That is entirely the wrong question.
I'm back.
I have no plan whatsoever. Horizonberg was just making a comment that I thought might be interesting to address quickly. No, I think
cool. I'll do that. As usual, I end up commandeering the plan, so yeah.
That's fine. I'm writing a video response to the Distributus latest on race at the moment, so I'm grateful this is saving my voice for that. But Horizonberg made a comment that would maybe be useful as a recap of the previous conversation to address. So Horizonberg says, when you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he's a woman and ... Now, this is obviously referring to the fear of gender-neutral washrooms. Like, here's the crucial thing. I dislike how that debate is usually framed. So typically what happens is someone will voice the concern, and there's an element of legitimacy here, that gender-neutral washrooms allow men to go into a sensitive space in proximity to women who may have very good reasons to be concerned about that. Right. Now, the response to this is that trans people rarely, if ever, are responsible for instances of sexual assault in bathrooms, and that's statistically true. But that but that doesn't itself obviate the concern about people using that as a cover. Right? So
no, it doesn't. But here's okay.
No, go on, please.
So I'm just eating nuts that are possibly stale. So sorry.
That's an excellent metaphor for this. So I'll keep going.
Man, some secret pervert. Anyway, okay. We're not going to talk about that anymore. Sunday's perverseness. So basically, what I'd say to that is that, okay, so here's the difficulty: is that trans people are people, right? So therefore, there's going to be 2 points. First point, which I know doesn't quite answer this. Trans people are people, so there's going to be a contingent of that group that is badly motivated, criminal, weird, whatever. And there's a sort of rhetoric in general that like trans people should be framed as these like perfect, like condescended to little like angelic saints, and if you don't frame trans people as like saintly as a general category, that you're being discriminatory, when of course there's like evil individuals in any group. And there's also going to be evil individuals who take advantage of norms or social practices or things that are extremely existentially important to people to advance their own effed up aims. And that's going to happen. That's just the reality of living in a society, is you're going to have people who do that. And also there's this idea that when you're looking, here's one danger potentially with Persian thinking in potentially the simplistic sense, which is when you're looking just at the causal, and this is not what Peirce is saying in his pragmatic maxim, but if you look at just the causal effects of things in the world, you could see there's going to be three people who would look, let's say there's three people who look, act, and behave identically. But one of them is a Twinkie gay man, one of them is a trans woman, and one of them is a nefarious sexual abuser man dressing as a woman. The instance of the third person, first of all, that person in many ways, if they're doing this just for the sake of being predatory, that's a straight person. That's a cis person pretending to be a trans person for the sake of being predatory. So that's not a trans person problem. That's a cis person problem then, first of all. Secondly, that predatory person may look like these other two types of people in the same way that you literally have like the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood, like dressing as the grandmother, but absolutely is not the same type of person. And in fact, J.K. Rowling gives us a wonderful way of framing this insofar as she kind of brings up the issue of like the Death Eaters versus other wizards, and the idea that like just because it's magical or involves wizardry or the occult or strange things like that doesn't necessarily mean these people are evil, and that there's moral complexity, and there's people who are going to take any well-held, well-developed culture and twist it to Death Eater type evil ends, and they're not even properly speaking necessarily part of that culture. So it's weird because it's like that would be probably a straight dude appropriating something about trans womanhood to do this, and that happens very rarely, and that's a problem. But think about the other cost would be. The other cost is that what about women? Like what about trans women? Like trans women as women going into a men's washroom and being beaten to death. That happens a lot more often. So the idea that you have to go to the washroom that matches your genitals results in a lot more chaos and pain and suffering for trans women than it does necessarily for women, although that is a serious issue of guys pretending to be women and doing that, mimicking actual trans people to do that on rare occasions. So it's complex, but I would say at the same time, the risk is far more to women having to go into men's washrooms, right? So, or trans men.
That's a statement of degree, but I think generally people. I mean, it's the fact that children are involved that makes it particularly sensitive. Now, that being said, as you pointed out, the issue here isn't trans women going into the washrooms per se. The implication specifically is that it's cis men using a policy that permits that permits a wider understanding of gender for people to go into the washrooms, can use that as a cover. Now, I have no idea as to how frequently that.
And if the result of that policy, yes,
but, so that's a pragmatic question. That's now what's the only thing that's troubling about that is that gets that gets appended, however, to debates about the legitimacy of trans women's identities. Sort of whole cloth, because that now comes to like really what is the activity of cis men becomes appended to perceptions of trans women generally.
But that's about as ridiculous then as saying that, and this does happen, and humans are going to do that, but that's about as ridiculous. Yeah, that's about as ridiculous as saying that, oh my God, this what I thought was Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother was actually a wolf, so every old woman's a wolf. It's like, no, that's really a specific rare case. And the other, again, to reiterate, difficulty with this is that if women, trans and otherwise, can't use women's washrooms, suddenly what happens is trans women have to go into men's washrooms. And for a lot of like very delicate estrogenated trans women, especially, or even just small trans women, that is like deadly in a lot of settings.
Now that being said, now the TERF response to that, if I may, would be that, well, not every grandmother is a wolf. However, every grandmother doesn't have, wolf fangs, wolf features, what have you. But then, like, what I would think of there is this is why the distinction between gender and sex is important, because, for example, you can look at, like, I don't know, what's another fictional case where some kind of animal creature occupies, like, a parental role, right?
Yeah,
like,
and so basically they're saying
that's a great example. So, like what raises Mowgli? Like, he has a panther as almost a father figure, right?
yeah,
But the panther doesn't cease to be a father figure because he's a panther.
exactly.
Like,
And part of what
token, the wolf could have been, in this ridiculous alternative reality, could have been actually a legitimately nurturing influence in Red Riding Hood's life.
um, oh
Okay.
dear God. Okay. So no, but oh God. Okay. So
best
here's the thing, that might be a bit wrong. That might actually be a bit wrong, even in our like insane alternate, like motherly wolfkin, otherkin world,
Yeah.
which this is why this might be wrong, is because basically, let's get down to like brass tacks about this. It's the thing that I absolutely hate, which is the argument that like the possession of a penis makes you de facto predatory, right?
Mm.
And so it's this idea that like, I mean, I don't know why males enjoy framing themselves as animals so frequently. You think this would be like beneath the dignity of human beings to want to constantly frame themselves as like animalistic in their predatory tendencies?
That is as mysterious to me as it is to you. I don't find that remotely appealing.
It's like, oh, I'm just this giant like predatory animal. And it's like, you feel good about that because you're supposed to be a meta aware human with dignity. Like, and if you want me, and also there's this idea that they are kind of proud of that. Like, I should just be in terror of that. But then, in which case, smaller men should be in terror of bigger men, and we're all just in a horrible brute force like totalitarian regime where thugs rule everything. So it's just really kind of like repulsive and actually more insulting to them than anyone else. But at the same time, it's like we all have impulses. All human beings have impulses. And in the instance of, and I don't have impulses to assault people with a penis. Throwing that out there. But
would you
nonetheless,
assault somebody using something else?
I have to say I don't have those impulses, but presumably there's a range of people who have those impulses. And basically, and of course they're going to chalk that up to my femaleness, but whatever. So basically, there's a range of people who have impulses. And the idea is that in the instance where you get, like you made this point before, someone who's actually psychopathic and who also has the ability to do something, then bad stuff happens. But the determining factor here is the psychopathy, not the possession of a penis.
Yeah.
So basically, insofar as most people are not psychopathic, whether or not they possess a penis, and possessing a penis is not determinant of gender as a woman just as much as not possessing a uterus in the case of total hysterectomy doesn't determine the gender of a woman, like fully determined necessarily. That's what I'm talking about here. Like, this is what we're arguing against, an extreme position, frankly, even if it's a popular one. Then that becomes an issue of somebody being a psychopath and then having the ability to do that by mimicking a legitimate group of people. So then it becomes, what's the greater risk? Is a greater risk to trans women who then get to death, or is the greater risk the psychopath who occasionally will do this? I know what my answer would be to that. In addition to that, it encourages people who otherwise wouldn't want to go through like a heavy transition process in some instances if they're in a really conservative place. People who are like, I can't politically stand to continue to have the word trans associated with me. I need to drop it. I need to identify fully with whatever gender I'm quote transitioning to, just to like get people off my back so that, you know, I no longer possess the appendages that would make me monstrous or something like that. Right.
Well, perversely, I mean, what this attitude represents is an assumption that possessing male genitalia, like as if an aspect of being a man, is specifically being to a certain extent a psychopath or a sociopath.
Exactly. Right? And that's extremely insulting. And I think males should be largely extremely insulted by that, even though they seem to perpetuate it as a view, some of them. So this gets into some of the Rowling stuff later on. And she always does the thing of like, I know I felt sexless. It was natural for a woman to be indignant at the limitations posed on her by her sex. If I lived now instead of 30 years ago, I might have tried to transition, but I went through the feminist struggle. We've been through, I think, in some pretty careful detail, the difference between somebody who's, you know, identified as a woman and wants to complete and fill out that identity and resist oppression and assault and all these other awful things and actualize themselves, and somebody who has well-held reasons for wanting to see themselves socially as a man and to behave and function as a man in the world. There's a different set of categorizations around those things. Then there's this other really stupid thing where she gets into like, but as many women have said before me, and this is sort of thrown in there like out of the blue, so it's really okay for me to read it out of the blue.
Sure.
Women is not a costume. Woman is not an idea in a man's head. Good Lord. Woman is not a pink brain, a liking for Jimmy Choo's, or any other of the sexist ideas now somehow touted as progressive. Moreover, the inclusive language that calls female people menstruators or people with vulvas strikes many women as dehumanizing and demeaning. I understand why trans activists consider this language to be appropriate and kind, but to those of us who have degrading slurs spat at us by violent men, it's not neutral, it's hostile and alienating. So this is a classic Rowling move, which is to throw in a fairly complex point about how we ought to refer to people who fulfill similar bodily functions when those functions are politicized and where, you know, menstruation has been treated as this very, God, you can't even speak about it in a normal medical register without a reaction of absolute disgust.
Yeah.
That's the level that we're dealing with. When it's not something I don't think that should be like, I would not personally want to indulgently dwell on the concept. At the same time, I think that it's culturally incredibly overwrought and overdetermined. So I get her point kind of in a way there. I want to steer away from that though, because what I want to note instead is that there's this subtle, not so subtle insinuation that trans women really just have this idea they're going to be cute and frilly and pink and wear Jimmy Choos and, you know, become the accessories of men and be like, oh my God, and like live up to these idealized notions of femininity. Well, okay, so maybe some trans women do that. Maybe some people aren't that critical about how they take on their gender, but then you have to go after all the other women who do that, who aren't trans, and go after, you know, why they're some daddy's baby girl and why they want to submit for, you know, and for a Chanel purse. And like, you know, you kind of want to, you have to go after the gay men who did that. Like there's a lot of people who are doing that and you have to go after all of them.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But they're not going to. They're going to go after some of the trans women who maybe have not had as long to come up with an incredibly nuanced, particular expression of femininity, and therefore are going to go after that. It seems like a weird low blow for no reason whatsoever. And then basically she finally ends it off in a way that always stresses me out, which is getting into how, look at all the violent, horrible things that have happened to me and the scars left by violence and sexual assault in my own life. And that basically she has solidarity and kinship with trans people, even though trans women are not women, basically. And she has a visceral sense of terror in which, you know, she's trying to relate to trans women. I think this is a particularly generous move in an otherwise bizarre piece. And then basically she's saying that trans people need and deserve protection. They're most likely to be killed by sexual partners who, if they work in the sex industry and they're trans women of color, they're at risk.
So
like every other domestic.
This is kind of fascinating because what she's doing here is she's taking precisely the kinds of sort of cynical, you know, the cynical corporate use of sort of feminist talking points, specifically to motivate. I mean, she even touches on Donald Trump at one point, specifically to motivate.
Pathos.
I guess not, because she's taking a feminist position, but it's a specific sort. So I don't think that's necessarily.
She's making an important and good claim to a terrible end of trying to force people to take on all the other really violent and suspect stuff she's doing. That's why I don't like it. And that's why I find it really brutal, and why I don't want to like return it in kind to her by delegitimizing her or mocking her for some of the horrible, violent experiences she's faced, right? As a poor woman. So he's like poor as in physically poor, like broke.
No, she was actually impoverished at one point. Yeah. Yeah,
she was impoverished, and she was stuck in an abusive relationship, which, you know, it's awful because you.
But actually, like not in an ambiguous sense. Like she was actually physically assaulted.
She was physically assaulted, sexually assaulted. I mean, my personal view is that relentless emotional abuse takes the same toll as physical abuse. I
would agree too, but it's less anecdotal at this point. Like it's
just visceral.
No
right? There's a visceral. There's a visceral element, and And like bluntly, I went through visceral physical abuse at a juncture in my life too. And so I know how, and felt beholden to that person for a while. So I know how that feels. It's awful. You don't ever want to be in that situation and you feel like you are no longer a person. So it's not a good thing. So basically, yeah. And so then to continue on from that, you know, she went out, she couldn't shut out memories, you know, even now when she's with a good man, she remembers the violent man. And somehow trans women get looped into this because it's just men and another guys, but maybe not, but maybe they're women, but maybe they struggle parallelly, but maybe they don't. And so then it ends in this horrible kind of convoluted way. And it's like, please be empathetic. So that was a big kind of semi-train wreck. The one thing that I didn't bring up that is super contentious to bring up that nobody brings up for this reason that she gets into, and I'm kind of glad she did. So I wanted to do like one little spicy thing about this.
Okay, where is this? Just so we can follow along.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, where is this? Oh, this is like so, I can't believe I'm going to do this to myself and have to discuss this. So this is the third page in.
Oh, this is just one long document. So it's near the end, okay?
It's near the beginning.
Oh.
Most people aren't aware. I certainly wasn't. That ratio is now reversed. Just you can copy or control for 4,400% increase like that.
Go. Got it.
Yeah, I'm gonna read this because this is the kind of thing that nobody wants to talk about. So I'm gonna read it. All right, how do we do this? Most people aren't aware. I certainly wasn't until I started researching this issue properly, aka according to a gender critical perspective. Like, keep in mind that she's very biased in what she's accessing here. About 10 years ago, the majority of people wanting to transition to the opposite sex were male. That ratio has now reversed. The UK has experienced a 4,400% increase in girls being referred for transition treatment. Autistic girls are hugely overrepresented in their numbers. The same phenomena has been seen in the US. In 2018, American physician and researcher Lisa Littman set out to explore it. In an interview, she said parents online were describing a very unusual pattern of transgender identification where multiple friends and even entire friend groups became transgender identified at the same time. I would have been remiss had I not considered social contagion and peer influences as potential factors. Wow, so there's a lot in here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a secret thing that people think about trans people, but nobody ever says, right? Which is that, you know, it's peer pressure, right? It's like, it's all really just trans trending. It's all really just people being influenced to do something because it seems politically salient. And, you know, especially when girls are doing it, maybe they're trying to get a little bit of male power, right? And why is it suddenly girls? And so this is part of her argument is that,
well, that's actually just as a brief addition to that, just with respect to the gynotopia comment, that's in both directions at the same time.
I know. So it suddenly becomes almost absurd. Although I get the sentiment behind the comment, it becomes kind of like absurd. So basically, what's going on here is that she's trying to make this point that like we're no longer able to deal with the violent misogyny that's directed against girls and women. So much so that girls are opting to just leave womanhood altogether to become these kind of self-styled men. And that's because we're no longer able to adequately deal with misogyny. Now, we're not adequately dealing with misogyny or misogynistic violence or intersectional violence. Intersectional is a different issue. Intersectional violence or anything like that. I do believe that we are insufficiently considered on these points, also because we've lapsed into kind of lazy ideology around some of it. So that is a problem. That being said, what would be the reason for this reverse? Well, first of all, transsexuality was considered a uniquely male condition in the DSM-3 and beyond until about the DSM-5. So it was usually indicated.
Can you explain what that is? Can you explain?
So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is a psychiatric document that diagnoses people with personality disorders as well as mood disorders. And of course, gay and trans sexualism were being gay and homosexuality and transsexualism were included in the DSM, I think until the 1970s in the first one, and then recently until the 2000s in the second one, because of the whole pathological history of those terms and the need to pathologize people identifying a certain way as being inverts and exhibiting inverted behavior and that kind of thing. So what they decided that, you know, classically when someone feels like they're the wrong sex, it's a male. So they kind of arbitrarily just decided that transition surgery would largely be from male to female, and that transsexualism really was only an issue with males. And that was written into the psychiatric definition, mainly because nobody bothered talking to, operating on, or discussing things with female patients around that time. It just wasn't standard medical practice.
And just for anyone who's interested in looking at this further, in my previous discussion with Djalma, we actually went into quite a bit of detail on this, because it actually is really linked with eugenics as to how these categories were formed. They did not encompass simply, there isn't a one-to-one relationship between what was mentioned by this in this earlier period as there is now. Like, these aren't the same thing. Even it did include people of that description, but it didn't have them sort of conceptualized in the way that we talk about them today.
Yeah, so exactly. So what I'd say is, like, so I'm getting kind of tired out, but like the one I'd say, there's two parts to this. One is that, sure, back then, women didn't have the capacity to radically reimagine their identities along multiple axes to the point they were able to really question in common social parlance whether they were women. First problem. And so that's why maybe there's experienced a massive uptick. The second issue, which I think is more to the heart of it, is that it just wasn't made scientifically, psychiatrically, and medically available to people who were female to transition, because it was considered a uniquely male phenomena in the psychiatric for very specific reasons. So that's because it's not written into the social script bluntly. So it's much harder to deal with and to imagine an unknown, right?
Yeah. So what Rowling's doing here effectively is she's confusing a greater sensitivity of the ability of science to detect the numbers of people in these categories with the emergence of people of these descriptions, when in fact it may just be the case this sudden uptick is simultaneously the product of people being able to measure this in the population, as well as there being opportunities for people to actually become aware of these categories as things that they can identify with.
Yeah, that's super well worded. That's exactly how I'd frame it. And then, like, good job throwing like autistic girls under the bus too, in the process of her doing that. So basically, it's like, well, then, but if this is, but nonetheless, the question remains, like, look, is this like a peer pressure thing? Like, are there a bunch of like trans trending teenagers, and like in reality, who are going to take back their decision? Like, is this a peer pressure thing? But the difficulty is that when it comes to the formation of gender over time, yes, it makes reference to natural or biological or hormonal factors. Like, for instance, we don't know how these necessarily map onto discrete behaviors. But for instance, somebody who has more estrogen in their system is probably going to cry more easily than someone who doesn't. It's just like a fact. It's not that they experience deeper, more irrational emotions. It's that they're more likely to physically be able to release the emotions or express themselves, right? Or they talk more. But it doesn't in some cases. So it doesn't, but not all. Like, sometimes there's going to be little things that happen that map onto hormones or map onto natural elements. But in general, socialization takes a long time. Otherwise, we wouldn't be so concerned about raising our children. They come fully formed and be like, that's it, out into the world. Now, you could abuse someone horribly or treat them wonderfully, and you get the same product.
Now, there's a rub, however. There's a rub, however, in that as you were saying, like, the socialization does play a role. So there being people who want to transition for social reasons apart from identity, apart from sort of a genuine identity, that's still potentially a thing. Like, that's not obvious. Potentially, yeah.
But also, no, it's not obvious. I'm usually in discussions, those options.
Yeah.
Totally. And whenever I'm making any of these points, all those counterpoints are not necessarily obviated at all. They're just not. They shouldn't be assumed to be the default thing you would assume in that instance. Like, they're not obviated, but they're also not the default assumption necessarily when there's other more compelling explanations. So basically, so you have a situation in which you make reference to multiple social factors in developing identity, despite the fact there are also natural factors. And so you have these groups of girls who basically develop as women together, having gone to a girls' school back in the day, I saw this phenomenon, and it was really kind of effed and toxic, and a lot of people ran with that and didn't resist it at all for the rest of their lives. And so people do this, right? They develop their identities together. It doesn't mean that they're not tracking real factors in doing that. And again, you have a constant issue of, well, then how do you account for girls developing their womanly identities together in groups in the similar way? So you get kind of a...
Or, if I may, like, it may be that the basis of these friendships was a shared identity in the first place. Like, it may be that
they sought each other out.
Exactly. Like there may be a sort of a self-selection process here where people who have what they would discover to be a male identity prefer the company of people who are like them in that respect, probably because they would probably treat each other in certain respects. And now I don't know if this is actually true in any case, but they would probably, I expect they would probably treat each other the way in which they would prefer to be treated in a masculine fashion. And then they would also not be treated as members of an outgroup by cis males, as you tend to expect. So it doesn't.
Yeah, and there's some problems with that because you want,
No, please continue.
You don't want to get into I'm just agreeing with you basically. Like you don't want to get into like a circuitous echo chamber too much, as you go through life, and it's important to interface the wider society.
This is all provisional, right? Like the major objection here is an assumption of like one strict model for how people develop, for how people associate, for how they identify.
Exactly.
That is under argument.
But also that in the identical case, between somebody who is trans and somebody who is not, with the identical factors at play, one is somehow okay and one is somehow not okay because of naturalism, because of believing in genitals like Santa Claus, like at that level, is like.
Which frame, by the way, is not traditional at all. It's very new.
Oh, actually, in fact, the one-sex model, where basically women were deviations and sort of inferior iterations of men, was pervasive until the 1700s, right? And even in Aristotelian and scholastic rhetoric, there's this idea of women as somehow like failing to attain something men attain, but being a similar type of being. Like,
exactly, like biologically being underdeveloped males.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's evidenced by menstruation because there's an excess of humor, right? Blood is a humor in the body, and therefore, they're not making good use of all their fluids. Isn't that lovely? So good, they're not making good use of all their fluids. That's really the reason given in some scholastics views. But there's one other thing here that I kind of think is important to remember just in terms of reading things and looking at sources. Where is she getting this sense from about these female? So the 4,400% increase is just one of those random stats that's thrown in without being referenced. That's just terrible practice. But where's she getting this idea that whole friend groups are becoming trans at the same time? From parents online describing it. Like, think about this. She's parents going online and being like,
Now, there's one case that comes immediately to mind, and that is the Wachowski sisters. Right? But that's the only one.
The twins are whacked out. Twins are scary to me. Like, they might be the same person. I don't know. They freak me out a little bit. Like, no offense to any twins who are, listening to this, but they could really be the same person. Anyway, they're not. But twins are very uniquely and intimately influenced by each other, like across the board, I would say. Ugh. I mean, good. Twins are good. But nonetheless, watch me have twins or something at one point or something. So basically,
subscribers after this will know.
Yeah. So basically, it's somebody writing online, what I've noticed? My son, quotation marks, came out, but all his quotation marks friends did the same thing. I noticed that too. So there's a couple of things wrong with this. First of all, it's the anecdotal evidence of a second party in isolation. Right. Secondly, it's the judgment of the parents that this is what's happening. We don't know this is actually what's happening. It's them being like, what I think is going on, over a glass of Chardonnay. I think this. I'm not trying to be sexist with it, but it's like they're having that little chat.
No, that's a really good point, because exactly what's
going on as individuals.
Well, exactly what I was mentioning was going on earlier, where she was equivocating the sensitivity of science to the existence of these people, to the sudden proliferation of these people. Well, I mean, that can be mirrored in parents suddenly being aware of a proliferation of these people. Maybe they're what is the definition of a friend in this case, right? Oh, there's several people who came out as trans in my kid's school, therefore a lot of people in their friend group are suddenly coming out as trans simultaneously.
Yeah. And so there's a first point of they seek each other out just like girls who love makeup and hyper feminine materials behaviors would seek each other out. That's the first thing. And secondly, it's there's a bunch of parents kind of having a little secret chat about what they think might be going on, which, as we know, is terrible evidencing. This is secondhand evidence coming from a place of ignorance potentially about what's actually occurring on the inside of these situations, where whole conclusions are being drawn from the secondhand observation of Karen down the street, bluntly. Right. So I don't know I just don't know how effective that is. Like, if my mom said something, and she's a brilliant, brilliant woman, but if she said something to someone anecdotally, I don't think she'd want that quoted somewhere as evidence for the interiority of an entire group of people she doesn't belong to.
Right.
Right? As the primary evidence we're using here. So this is like, don't do this. Like, give me data, give me actual arguments, give me some phenomenology, give me something to work with here.
Yeah,
this is just describing what somebody said.
I would want a footnote here. This is, it's not, it doesn't even tell us how many, right?
No.
So look, okay, hang on. So there is.
Okay, well, Lisa Lippman said this in an interview, so maybe she said how many.
Okay, well, maybe, again, there's not a value here. Parents online. Okay, how many? Like how many of these parents were in the same marriage, for one? Like if you like, is this groups of parents? Is this how many are referring? Like it's yeah. But again, like I'm just thinking of like this definition of entire friend groups. I
know.
Like I remember growing up and something would happen to a kid in my school who I had no relationship with whatsoever. And like my mother or what have you my mother would ask, because my dad didn't care. Not that he didn't care, he didn't follow my school stuff. My mother would ask like, "Oh, wasn't that your friend from school?" It's like, "No, I never met that person." Or
and then and on the flip side of like, framing as friend groups kids who never actually hung out, which is completely legit. And on the flip side, you get, as surprised as nobody, people like me who had like one friend and were completely unpopular. My friend group was that one friend for 3 whole years until I managed to make a few more, right?
Yeah.
So that friend group would have been me and my friend like chatting about how we never did this. So that didn't happen to me, but it would have been like, you could have an echo chamber of like 2 or 3 kids basically. So yeah, that was
also
pretty intense. I don't.
It's also kind of worth pointing out too, like, think of the age ranges that we're talking about here. 10 years ago, the majority of people wanting to transition to the opposite sex were male. Okay, well, over the span of 10 years, you have, I mean, how many generations of elementary school students would pass through in that time? Probably about a little under 2.
Yeah.
Right. So you have a sudden shift of the schools towards, first of all, not allowing parity of these people. Like, I think that's a major factor too. Something that people don't tend to talk about is that trans people until very recently were the subject of really vicious parody. They were treated as clowns.
Totally.
So, I mean, again, is it any wonder that in addition to public spaces suddenly being not as accepting of that kind of ridicule, that suddenly you have a proliferation of people coming out as that thing? It's now not necessarily seen as
like a clownish behavior. So here's, in addition, the reason why it was considered clownish, and that whole thing is another video, and I'm too tired to kind of get into that right now. And we should probably switch to questions.
Soon, we can start to wrap up. We've been going for almost 2 hours.
And I'm like, I don't
want to wear either of us
over. Yeah, so I'm starting to feel over a little bit.
Okay, I'll tell you what. Let's actually, I'll let you finish your thought. Then let's take questions, and we can end whenever you like.
Okay, that sounds good. When you're first taking questions, I need to grab my water again. So basically, what the clown rhetoric and all that has a lot to do with the idea that masculinity is considered natural, innate, in common discourse, and kind of like ideal and like associated with dignity and positive virtue and all these other things that we put into the universal masculine, and that feminine expression is kind of like frivolous, clownish, silly, frilly, ornamental, and designed to appeal to men. And so, of course, the idea is that a man could want to like ornament himself to become womanly, and that was the kind of the prejudice idea, I think, that's behind a lot of like the idea of allowing inverts to transition from male to female but not vice versa, is that, well, they're not really women, but they kind of want to put on this aesthetic on top of their natural default self. But this kind of simultaneous misogynistic idea that we see even in women being frivolous or non-serious, or as we were discussing with socialization previously, that they wouldn't have the like foresight or mental strength, bluntly, or character to want to transition to become this like universally heroic masculine type. And you see this even in like creepy stuff that like, you know, Ayn Rand writes about, like women versus men.
Right.
The Randian heroine is like the freakiest, weirdest, most contradictory thing ever, that lives for the man but lives for itself. And you're like, that doesn't make sense. Like, that doesn't make sense. But that's still in there. And this idea that somehow like you couldn't get a frivolous being to be serious, but you could have a serious being have a desire for frivolous eccentricity, and that misogyny and that double standard is still in there. And so there's this idea that, well, why would a woman transition? You have tomboys, they'll never be men. You have other types of expressions, they'll never be men. I mean, if any, and Rowling kind of even hints at that here, where she's like, you know, I felt kind of sexless. And it's like, really? So you think that trans men are just women who've been oppressed too long and therefore feel asexual or androgynous or sexless? Like, that's a different phenomena. There is nothing sexless about the majority of trans men. So it's one of these things where it's like, and there's actually nothing sexless bluntly about the majority of women, which is still a problem that we have, acknowledging female sexual autonomy and desire. It's
Now,
a whole
maybe,
thing. I mean,
maybe that is the case, however, through a self-selection process, in the experience of men who do presume that.
Of course, because if you're only appealing if you're passive and pursuable and amenable and you're playing semantic games and you're not forthcoming and you're hard to get and you're like challenging in a specific sense, and that is secure, and that's how you secure your survival and your family and your ability to have children and live in the world, then like hell you're going to be asexual. You're going to be the most prudish asexual thing imaginable, because that's what's going to bluntly get that person off, right? For the sake of your own survival. That's a classic rhetoric anyway, on that note. And that is part and parcel of that oppression, which is that, you know, it's because you don't want to be disgusting, right? Anyway, so, and that pervades a lot of things too, I think. But then this idea that trans men are kind of these like sort of anemic, sexless, like women, and trans women are these like pervert men, is like really, really central in a lot of the rhetoric here.
Yeah.
So yeah, it sucks.
Okay.
I'm pretty much done. Like let's
if anybody has any questions, we'll go for 9 minutes, I think, maximum, until we hit the 2 hour mark, and then we'll call it, because this is too long. So
this is a lot of rolling. This is yeah. I mean, I enjoyed it, but this is a lot of rolling.
So if anybody has any questions, you don't have to have questions, but if you have questions or comments, now's the time. Otherwise,
I'll answer anything.
Yeah. Anything.
Well, yeah, I'll answer it. It may not be the answer you want, but I'll answer everything.
Cheating. Nope. No questions?
No questions. Okay.
Are we all worn out?
Yeah, I think so.
Give him one more minute.
Yeah, we'll take it easy. I'm gonna get some water and come back.
Yeah, I will too.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'm back. We're just waiting for Djalma. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, we're just wrapping up now, so now's the time. Okay. Well, I'll just throw up, because maybe we missed some things, because we weren't really answering questions throughout this chat.
I can't really see any of it anyway right now, and I'm being.
No, I'm looking, and I'm not seeing a lot of questions.
Okay.
I am seeing a long conversation about male lactation, which I would appreciate to never see that again.
Oh God, that's your nightmare.
Don't say that. People start sending me things.
It's over.
No,
Non-stop lactation means.
Okay, so here's one. Katsuma Kyoto asks. I think you actually already answered this. Yeah. So why? This wasn't even a question. This was just a comment, really. Why we should predict that males' biology coded to be predatory. So we already gone over that.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's not relevant. It's not relevant, is the point.
Right. Horizonberg asked a question.
Okay.
So it's two parts. So I agree with your takes much more than Rowling. Still, the left is by nature a very Big Ten sort of phenomenon, and Rowling and trans activists probably have more goals in common than not. Is there a way to prevent these important disagreements from getting in the way of pursuing mutual goals?
My answer is going to seem glib, and I don't want it to, just because I'm a bit tired. I would say approaching these issues with greater descriptive detail and not assuming that gender is merely about the political goals associated with being oppressed, so that's an important part of it, or about physical biology. Starting to talk about some of what gender roles are, what it means to be socially a certain way, to just describe experiences of being gendered across the board, and to make less of a distinction between non-trans people or non-conforming people who just have one way of existing that we never talk about, and trans people that we talk about endlessly.
Yeah.
And to start to have more universal discussions about what it means to actually exhibit a social identity. I think that would help a lot. And Halberstam did that in talking about the border wars between butch lesbians and trans men from about 1990 in a book, a really excellent book that only the 90s could produce, really, called Female Masculinity. It's an excellent book. So that's one place where that discussion really gets going.
Yeah, I just wanted. Here we go. Question: what will your next project be with Djalma? I have no idea.
We kind of come up with stuff that like gets us annoyed or that we're interested in. I mean, he's kept me on pretty like intense political applied topics. We could go into something more
fair,
like
though,
reform philosophical.
That's been your specialty for a decade now.
It has been. I'm increasingly like moving away from it for the sake of moving back to it with more rigor in future. So the last 3 or 4 years, not as much, but
Yeah.
he's definitely like making super good work of a thesis I wrote about 12 years ago. And he's forcing me to update it and critically consider how it's still relevant. So it's really like, I love doing this. It just, I'm doing other stuff too. Yeah.
Yeah. So who knows? But
Who knows?
It'll be interesting, so I can promise that.
We're open to suggestions as well. Like if people are interested in hearing us talk about stuff, which is probably a miracle, then we are open to suggestions.
Yeah.
I'd say. Yeah.
Tangy asks, will technology solve all these gender problems? Can we just, I'm assuming that says innovate our way out of it?
I think at this rate, it's actually going to make it worse. Because humans are incredibly clever. Like I have this point about being clever but not intelligent, which I should just drop because it's becoming like ideological at this point. And basically it's that what we're going to do is we're going to innovate into actuality, the ideology. Like we're going to innovate and make more distinct categories that we could have made less distinct. Like we're going to probably end up doubling down on some divisions that we shouldn't double down on. Right. And we might do it in a way that writes people out of the picture or denies them fullness and fluidity of expression. So I think that we could end up innovating ourselves into a grave, basically.
So how I would phrase that, if I may, how I would phrase that is, we're going to come at these questions of identity and things like that with vastly underdeveloped frameworks, but we're going to be able to technologically strong-arm these frameworks into seeming viable. Exactly.
Yeah. That's a much better way of putting it.
Does anybody else have any questions, comments? Nope. I'm hoping not, because I want to go. All right. Well, thank you very much, Djalma. I'm gonna call it at this point. We're at the remarks. So, thank you very much for coming on. That was very interesting. I think the audience agreed.
Pleasure as always.
It's always a good sign when you have a rough parity of likes to dislikes. That means engagement. So,
oh my gosh. Okay, so there's
not that bad. I think we're at like 10-6. Last I checked.
Ooh, okay, that's fine.
No, that's a good thing. That's a good thing.
People who dislike it and who dislike my views, I'd be willing to discuss it with them as well. So putting that one out there.
I love the people who consistently put Last Man asks, is Israel the ultimate national state? That's unrelated to the conversation, but thank you for that.
Yeah, that's...
I love the people who reflexively dislike all of my videos, and I'll tell you why. Some people will watch a video, they'll watch for like 5 seconds, they'll pass, they'll go, oh, that's okay, and they'll put a like down. The people who dislike, they cared. I love those guys.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. They do care. There is that.
But
okay.
All right. Well, anyways, thank you everyone for participating, and thank you, Djalma, for coming on. I hope we can do this again soon.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Ciao. Take
Okay.
care.
Go eat lunch. Have a good time.
Bye.
Dinner. Breakfast. Bye.